Hello everybody and welcome to this BSI webinar about COP28 and what it will mean for your organisations. Thank you very much for joining us today. We hope it will be a lively and interesting discussion for you. It's going to be conducted as a conversation and discussion with our expert panellists, and it will be prompted by questions that you have already put in or that you want to ask during the webinar. The webinar will be recorded later. Might need the next screen, which will help me explain all of the sort of different housekeeping issues here so that you're aware how to ask your questions in the Q&A function. And obviously, this will be available for you for reference later on, and we'll certainly make sure that you get some information about the timetable of events that our expert speakers are going to be at during the COP28. Now I'd like to hand over to Dr. Scott Steedman, who's our Director General Standards at BSI, to introduce our panel and the webinar. Thanks very much. Over to you, Scott.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and good day to everybody. Welcome to this seminar. This is a very moving and dynamic moment. COP28, as with that previous COPs, is always a bit of a bun fest, things changing all the time. And we thought it'd be really interesting to have a bit of a discussion today and answer your questions and introduce the concept of COP and what it means for all of us. I'm looking forward to being there myself. And as Sarah said a few minutes ago, as we get more details of the specific events, I know quite a few that I have to attend and I'm speaking at, and our panelists likewise, but these are changing all the time, every single day. I had a new appointment this morning, so we will share that with you after the event. But thank you again for joining us. We have a fantastic lineup of expert panelists for you, 3 panelists to talk about the COP process and what it means for us all. And I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves in a second. We look forward to that. So here we are, 3 super panelists. First of all, Alexis McGivern, who's Net Zero Standards Manager for the Oxford Net Zero Project, and she is joining us on the screen. Ira Punsken, who is Deputy Head of Policy for the UK Centre for Greening Finance and Investment, and also the Technical Lead for the Secretariat of the Transition Planning Task Force, so very much from the financial sector. And Martin Baxter, who is Deputy Chief Executive of the Institute for Environmental Management and Assessment, otherwise known as IEMA, and a major player in this space. You're very welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us, Alexis, Ira, and Martin. And I'm just going to invite you just to say a couple of words. Perhaps, Alexis, I could come to you first, just to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. It's great to be here. And my name is Alexis McGivern. I work for the University of Oxford in a research group called Oxford Net Zero, which represents about 30 researchers that sit across several departments of the university. So we have physicists who are doing climate modeling, we have lawyers looking at climate litigation, biologists looking at nature-based solutions, anthropologists looking at the just transition. So we represent a broad coalition of disciplines and backgrounds. And I sit within a 3-person, what we call an engagement team, which is basically how do we take all of this academic knowledge and make sure that credible net zero is operationalized across multiple different stakeholder groups. So we work with the standards community with BSI, we work with policymakers and regulators, work a lot with businesses and a lot with civil society on how they can apply the pressure for more credible net zero. So I'm really delighted to be here today.
Alexis, thank you very much indeed. Fascinating. So much to talk about. Ira, would you like to say a few words?
Of course, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's great to have a chance to chat about COP28. So as you said, I wear 2 hats here. On the one hand, I'm the Deputy Head of Policy at the UK Centre for Greening Finance and Investment. And what that organization is, it's a consortium of different universities. And that brings together various different people from different aspects of climate science and tries to bring the knowledge that they have gathered into or create the connectivity between that and the financial sector. So making sure that all of the insights that are being generated on things like physical and transition risks are put into a format that financial institutions and decision makers can start to use to make more informed, better capital allocation decisions on the back of that data and analytics. Secondly, I'm also the technical lead of the Transition Plan Task Force Secretariat. So together with the climate think tank, CGFI has a mandate from government to form the Secretariat for a public-private task force that for the past year and a half has been working on developing a disclosure framework for what good practice transition plans look like for companies. So we've really been grappling with the challenge of what does not only good climate target look like, but more specifically, what do we need companies to be making public about the strategies and the plans that underpin those targets. And yeah, we recently launched a disclosure framework just a month and a half ago, and are working on a bunch of sectoral guidance on the back of that.
Fantastic, and such important work, and it has such an international sort of reach, doesn't it, Ira? I mean, you know, other parts of the world doing the same thing, so lots of stuff to talk about there. Martin, just to introduce yourself, a few words perhaps.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you for the invite. I'm Martin. I'm Deputy Chief Exec at IMA. We're the professional body for people working in sustainability. We have a very particular interest in supporting organisations to develop their capacity and capability to translate climate ambition into action. I think there's lots, and we'll get into this later, but our ambitions aren't being met by action on the ground and turning this into kind of practical projects and improvements. So enhancing that is critical. I'm also involved in standards, both here in the UK and at European and international levels. So it's great to be able to bring both of those perspectives to COP when we'll be out there at the end of next week.
Great. Okay. Well, listen, thank you all again. I suppose the big question really to kick off when I talk to people is they say, well, what is COP? So it's the conference of the parties, but then, you know, like Christmas parties, or what kind of parties are we talking about? Martin, what does it mean? What is the conference of the parties? What does it mean for organizations?
Yeah, I mean, so the COP is, you know, it's a coming together of countries that participate in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that convention is long-standing, and it's basically the forum where commitments are made to drive climate action. It's been in place for a long time. In the early days, it was just basically a forum for encouraging action. And then over time, you know, we had the Kyoto Protocol, which became, you know, for developed countries, more mandatory kind of action to cut emissions. And then more recently, we've had the Paris Climate Change Agreement in 2015, which was, you know, far more all-encompassing in terms of putting in place, you know, more serious and coordinated and kind of legally binding programs. It's worth just kind of dwelling on what that Paris climate change incorporated. So firstly, there is an agreement to hold temperature increases to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, get that right, pre-industrial levels, or well below 2 degrees. So and bear in mind, we're kind of pushing on that 1.5 degrees already this year, yeah. Probably 0.4. Secondly, it's about adapting to the adverse impacts of climate change and enhancing resilience, but also in a way that doesn't threaten food production. So that's kind of integrated into the climate change agreement, into the Paris Agreement. And then finance is also critical. So it's getting the finance flows to support, you know, countries to be able to meet their obligations and also adapt and become more resilient. Now, within that agreement, countries submit what's called their national determined contributions, but effectively it's their best endeavours to their contribution to ensuring that we hit those targets. And, you know, at the start of that, those don't add up to keeping us within 1.5 degrees. Over time, we've got a ratchet mechanism whereby countries enhance their ambition. So we've seen that happening. And so that's positive. And clearly then it's around delivery, which is the big issue. The COP also is this kind of framework for developing the rule book. So, you know, when countries are making commitments, and bear in mind, you know, with 190 odd countries all saying we're going to do something and we all have to work collectively to do that, actually kind of need some rules about how we're going to monitor, measure and report and verify performance. So that's really important. So getting that rule book in place for that, but also for other mechanisms like voluntary carbon markets, which is really important for companies as well. So it's taken a long time to get that into place. The other thing to kind of just to flag up is that we do have this kind of periodic, what's called a global stock take, which is to say, well, where are we? And how much has been done? How much have we got in the pipeline? Where are the gaps? And what do we need to double down on to do more? So what's really interesting is that now in the COP28, it will be where that first global stock take will be agreed. So we've got the kind of preliminaries on that. Final thing I'll say, just a couple of other issues that will rear their head, and obviously other people can kind of chip in, but loss and damage for the first time made it onto the agenda last COP, and that's really important around how do we compensate and support countries who are going to be negatively impacted on climate change from the emissions that industrial countries have already kind of put into the atmosphere and are driving climate change. So how do we do that, and the rules around that? So that's going to be a big part of this meeting. And then the other thing is just making sure that this finance flows. So there was supposed to be 100 billion a year US dollars flowing to support this, and every year we've missed it. It looks like when all the bean counters have got together, that potentially last year was the first time that we've been able to get 100 billion. But that needs to be every year, and that's a minimum. And if you think about inflation eroding that 100 billion, then there's a lot to do.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you so much, and maybe slightly reassuring if we're beginning to get the money starting to flow. Alexis, do you want to build on that, and then I'll come to you, Ira? What is the Committee of the Parties for you? What does it mean?
Yeah, thanks so much, and thank you, Martin, for that context. And sorry, I'm quite under the weather at the moment, so I'm sorry if I'm sniffling. But yeah, so I think to build on what Martin has just said, there's three pieces to a COP really. There's the negotiations, which is where the members of the UNFCCC, i.e. member states, will be negotiating on things like the cover decision, which is sort of each agreement that comes out of each COP on thematic decisions, and looking at submissions from countries, as Martin mentioned, the nationally determined contributions. The second piece is exhibits and side events. So that's really the piece about that is where non-state actors are, and that's about building partnerships and enhancing the participation of non-state actors, because there's two sort of component pieces, the state piece and the non-state piece. And the third element is political commitments. So these are bilateral or regional agreements that are made, things like the Global Methane Pledge, which was trying to address flaring, and the United States is kind of one of the big convening bodies working on the Global Methane Pledge. And this year, as with each year, there are initiatives that are led from the presidency side. So the COP presidency this year has focused on a few different areas, for example, having the first ever climate health ministerial, which is on December 3rd. And there's been some criticism that there is a climate health ministerial for the first time, but not talking about the health impacts of fossil fuels, but more of the health impacts of climate change, which is to do with sort of the sensitivity of who the presidency is and where the COP is located this year. There's also one of the other initiatives is the Global Cooling Pledge, which is trying to improve targets on efficiency for cooling, as well as having targets for cooling for the most vulnerable people. Which is interesting. And finally, there's, well, among others, but kind of one of the most interesting is the Declaration on Resilient Food Systems. So for a lot of the food systems folks that we work with, they're happy to see that there's kind of the first high-level commitment at the nexus of food and climate, and trying to scale up support for adaptation in the agricultural sector. And specifically, others specifically mentioned support for agricultural workers, who are some of the most so it's a huge amount of people working in the agriculture industry, including smallholder farmers, and some of the most vulnerable to things like extreme heat, for example. So yeah, just to build on what Martin has said, in our area of work, we're also very curious and following very closely and informing the net zero and accountability landscape. So there's been kind of an ongoing discussion about the quality and credibility of net zero pledges from the non-state side, and so we can discuss that a little bit more, but there's kind of a big accountability framework. I mean, a lot of IRA's work is also building on that, of making sure that an entity making a net zero pledge has to follow through with that pledge and have a high quality for that pledge. But that's just a little bit more detail about how the COPs are organized into those three kind of component pieces.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. So I kind of get the state bit and the non-state bit, and that's fine. But then this third bit, who does the presidency work with to get agreement on the pledges? I mean, just Is it everybody? Yes. Who actually has to say I pledge? Is it state actors or non-state actors or a mixture?
Yeah, so it's an area that I don't particularly work in, but at least for the Global Methane Pledge, for example, it's a state level initiative that they use the COP as a moment to rally support for. So a lot of what the Global Methane Pledge focuses on, for example, is ending flaring. And so the political representatives at COP will be there trying to kind of push the political idea. It's a lot of sort of diplomacy happening in situ during the COP. And the COP28 presidency then also has their own initiatives that they're trying to get signed on for, either from all parties or from all relevant parties. You know, they could get like a regional agreement on agriculture, for example. But that's more of the diplomatic work outside of the official negotiations.
Yeah, okay, super, thank you. Ira, would you like to build on that, what Martin and Alexis have said?
I mean, Martin and Alexis, I think, have already given a very good comprehensive overview. Maybe just to add 1 or 2 points. So from the perspective of kind of the work that I do, both at CGFI and the TPT, the area that I focus on particularly is on the non-state actor piece. So a lot of our thinking goes into how do you actually integrate and mainstream really good climate planning and transition planning into the private sector, and how do you ensure that the private sector is just making more informed and better decisions on all of the challenges that are coming down the line, both with the changing climate and the physical implications of that, but also with respect to actually accelerating the transition towards a low greenhouse gas emissions future that we need to see. And there, I think the value of COP28, as much as it is kind of an intergovernmental space, is really as this focal point every single year where various different actors that are working on these similar challenges come together and try to work through some of those nitty-gritty issues. And I think it's a space where we've seen a lot of really interesting momentum happening particularly over the last couple of 3, 4, 5 years, in terms of kind of bringing bits and pieces of the different ecosystem around how the private sector works together and actually trying to crunch through some of the different difficult challenges in terms of mainstreaming climate there. So a lot of the like side events and conversations that happen around it have started to attract really some of the big decision makers in the space, and that's oftentimes not really the country governments, but oftentimes it'll be regulatory networks, for example, where you have representatives from different states coming together and thinking through how you can create common frameworks for this. It'll be international institutions like the International Sustainability Standards Board that has a huge role to play in these kind of sideline conversations. So that's the space that from the perspective of the TPT and the CGFI, we'll definitely be watching quite closely, in addition to the important intergovernmental negotiation work that's happening.
Yeah, and at the European level, the EFRAG and the ESRS, that community as well. I mean, I think, you know, it's so interesting. We'll just dive into the themes in a second. But when I think about what our role is, and you just talked there about the regulatory space, I kind of think historically we've come from this world where you have like three circles, like a Venn diagram, but the circles are actually almost separated. The financial circle, if you like, the industry circle with its industry standards, and then the regulatory environment. And as you come into COP, they all start to overlap. And at COP, they're all on top of each other. So the regulators are trying to work out how on earth do we regulate to drive behavioral change using industry standards. And the industry people are saying, hang on a minute, this is my world. We make automobiles or whatever we do. And then the finance people say, well, we're in this space too now, because it's about non-financial reporting. And so this kind of convergence, all the stars come together on top of each other, makes for quite an interesting conversation. So thank you, that's really great. Can we just dive in a little bit and just talk perhaps about themes, the specific themes that you see? We've talked a little bit about regulation and methane and all sorts, but what do you think? Who would like to kick off on that? Maybe Martin, I'll come back to you. Themes from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, just building what Ira said, you know, the whole area of sustainable finance is absolutely essential, because, you know, it has the ability to drive, you know, organizations that may not have actually been hit by this directly, and I think that that's really a powerful driver. Now, getting that, if you like, a consensus around what that looks like, so that companies in different parts of the world that are going to be impacted by kind of changes in disclosure standards, etc., and having that common framework, I think is really important, particularly when we're starting to see the kind of the scope, I don't mean scope creep, but the all-embracing nature of the expectations from, you know, sustainable finance and moving into those disclosure standards around what's called scope 3, so those indirect emissions associated with your organization. That's a really kind of big driver, because it takes it from you as an individual organization to all of the interdependencies that you have through your supply chain in different parts of the world. mobilizing that and that information, and crucially then starting to drive climate action, i.e. making improvements, I think is really important. So that's kind of one area. I think the whole climate resilience piece is critical. And there are aspects that individual organizations can do themselves to enhance resilience, but generally it requires collaboration, partnership working in places in order to become resilient, because no one organization or one actor can do this alone. And I think there's an awful lot more that needs to be done, because we've seen the scale of the extreme weather events, whether it's extreme heat, whether it's flood risk, whether it's wildfires. This is coming at a magnitude that we didn't expect at this particular point in time. And when we're talking about infrastructure and fixed assets, which we thought were going to have kind of a long lifetime, and suddenly they're not fit for purpose for the extreme events that we're seeing, then how are we going to do that? And I think that's a really important piece as well.
Martin, let me come back to that point on resilience. And Ira, before we lose that finance piece, can I come to you about the finance that Martin raised? Come on, tell us what's happening. What do you think is going to happen on sustainable finance?
Okay, so first thing to say is that sustainable finance is a huge field, so I won't be able to do justice to all of it. But again, it might be worth just touching on there's an interstate element to this, and then there's what's happening on the sidelines. And I think the interstate elements in terms of where the big financing conversations are happening between governments are, as Martin already summarized, are around loss and damage. So what are the financing mechanisms that are needed to make sure that poor countries that are being hit by physical impacts have funding to essentially rebuild after major climate events and build resilience to it. There's an adaptation piece, because countries are increasingly realizing that there's a huge amount of financing gap in terms of actually building the resilience that we need to see in the immediate near future, even speaking about this decade. And then there's the conversations around the 100 billion target. But I think that's all. That's a little bit of the public conversation. On the private side, in terms of where do I currently see the big themes happening around what is the conversation on how do you actually get this into the private sector? I think there's three ones that are really worth calling out at the moment. First of all, I think there's a massive conversation happening across various different actor groups around the question of accountability, and particularly the accountability behind private sector climate pledges. So this isn't completely new, but it's definitely picking up momentum coming off of the back of the fact that we had this huge wave of private sector climate pledges coming out through Race to Zero over the last couple of years. But there's increasingly recognition that we need to get down to the next level of understanding who's actually putting the money where the pledge is, and starting to take the steps now to reach what they've said where they want to be in 10, 15 years. And that conversation is really picking up pace. The second one, which is a little bit linked to that, is various different groups are trying to grapple with what does transition finance mean. We've started to develop the infrastructure around understanding, okay, what is financing green and what is financing brown. We have taxonomies that allow us to categorize this. You can always have discussions around this, but a lot of the infrastructure at least has started to emerge. What now people are turning more attention to is understanding how do we make sure that those entities, for example, that are currently in high emitting sectors but need capital in order to be able to decarbonize, how can we extend that financing with the right amount of guardrails to ensure that that transition is actually happening, so that it doesn't become kind of a license to continue to pollute forever, but that it actually is supporting the transition that we need in some of the harder industries. Recognizing that we can't really operate in an economy where we are not producing things like steel and cement, but there's a need to finance the transition of some of these harder to abate industries. And then the third piece is, I think, that a lot of momentum that is currently happening around building international coherence and consistency around disclosure standards and understanding what is it that companies need to make public about both their climate pledges, but the climate related risks and opportunities as well as the transition plans that underpin them. So I already mentioned the International Sustainability Standards Board. The European standards have played a massive role in this as well. So I'll be watching that space quite closely to see what happens in the kind of ecosystem of trying to understand what do climate pledges means for financial reporting, what does it mean also for accounting. So that'll be, I think that's a third thing that I'm paying attention to.
And Ira, did you worry about divergence, or do you see convergence between these international reporting systems? The ISSB, you've mentioned, ESRS I mentioned, but also India has their own version, China has their own version. Is there a problem here for industry?
I don't want to downplay the challenges that companies currently face, because I think we are de facto in a situation where a lot of countries have tried to grapple with similar challenges at the same time. And what happens then is that you get approaches that haven't had an opportunity to fully join up. That
Right.
said, there have been, I think, quite important signs of merging recently with, right, you had the creation of the ISSB, which already consolidated the space quite significantly. You then had the FSB transferring the mandate regarding TCFD disclosures to the ISSB. That was another really big important piece. If you look at even what the ISSB has done, what the final ESRS standards look like, there's been a lot of work done to make sure that those are actually interoperable and work well alongside one another, despite having been developed kind of in parallel. So I think that they're really important and helpful signs of progress here at the moment.
Yeah, that's encouraging. And it takes me on perhaps to that question about net zero guidelines and the work that we've done in the international standards community to try and create a handshake between this work that you're describing from the ISSB and others, and your own work and the work in the UK, and the international standards system and all the standards that are used for companies to do their work and produce their products and deliver their services, and to ensure that that is compatible with, aligned with, so we have the minimum possible friction and the maximum interoperability between the non-financial reporting standards and the industry standards. And in that space, Alexis, we did a fantastic job actually last year of coming up with the ISO Net Zero guidelines, which I must say was one of my favorite documents to read last year. I actually, cover to cover, every dot and I read. And I love the way that we could explain to industry there all the different terminologies. We'll come maybe to the voluntary carbon market, the difference between carbon neutrality and net zero, and trying to create a common lexicon for industry and reporting. Alexis, do you tell us about that area?
Yeah, thank you so much, Scott. Yeah, it was indeed very exciting, and my colleague Kaya Axelson was very, very involved in that IWA process to get those net zero guidelines created, which is really exciting collaborative effort between thousands of people to kind of come to a common definition of what credible net zero looks like. So just to go back in time a little bit, COP26 was really about a massive proliferation of net zero pledges. We saw a huge increase in net zero pledges, and net zero increasingly being used as a frame for climate commitments. And then COP27 last year was really about kind of reining in what had become a little bit of a wild west of people making a net zero pledge but having no kind of definition against which they were being measured and no accountability mechanism to make sure that they were actually doing what they were saying. So really COP27 was about setting out what credible net zero looks like, and that was obviously through the ISO net zero guidelines, as well as Antonio Guterres's high-level expert group, which was an expert group that was put together to define what credible net zero looks like for non-state actors. So those were some key pieces in defining credible net zero, alongside the existing landscape, like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, to which the ISO Net Zero guidelines signpost a lot. So in terms of what Ira just said about interoperability, that is definitely something that was very intentional about the ISO Net Zero guidelines, to signpost that to best practice and just put it all in one place. And I think if we look forward on what this COP will be about for us, is what we're seeing is really about accountability. And so we use at Oxford the frame is the Tom Hale's conveyor belt, and I don't know if people are familiar with it, and we can put a link in the chat, but it's basically about how standards move from voluntary initiatives through to orchestration campaigns to standards, and then finally into regulation. And we really feel we're on the sort of end tail where we're focusing our attention, which is really on good, strong net zero standards and regulation to make sure that pledges are, we understand what we mean by a net zero pledge, and that there is some accountability mechanism. So just as an example, and bringing us back to what we discussed before about the presidency's initiative, one of their initiatives this year was what they called the Transition Plan Accountability Charter, which had quite high ambitions to require a very high climate commitment from any private company that registered to attend COP, because it's very politically contentious and difficult, and the first time that they were doing it has somewhat been kind of changed / watered down into recommending but not requiring companies to make transition plans in line with a best practice guide that they've put out. And so it's very much a voluntary initiative, but it does kind of signpost or signal to you can no longer come and participate in these spaces if you're greenwashing. And so it's an interesting piece. The other side of this is the UNFCCC, so the Framework Convention itself, working on what we call what they call the RAF, the Recognition and Accountability Framework, which is basically taking data, collecting data on what net zero pledges are, and kind of an expansion of the current global climate action portal, which is not very well used, and so trying to have a kind of validation and verification of a target, and we'll probably try to signpost to third parties in order to verify that. So that's sort of the accountability landscape. And for companies coming to COP28, I mean, to be speaking directly to the kind of private sector players who might be listening to the webinar, COP28 is very much an opportunity to demonstrate that they're working to meet those credibility standards, and that they're taking on board things like the ISO net zero guidelines or the high-level expert group's recommendations, and saying we are working to align as closely as possible with this with these credible kind of net zero targets. And so they're both being asked to do that, to in-house what they're doing, and to kind of support the policy landscape that would allow that transition to happen on a systems level. So the sort of rallying cry is double down, triple up, which is really led by the We Mean Business Coalition, about doubling down on energy efficiency and tripling up renewables. The kind of add-on to that slogan is double down, triple up, phase out. So, and the phase out being referring to fossil fuels. So not only getting your own house in order, but making sure that you're supporting the sort of policy landscape. And we've seen that in the UK recently too, like the big queue for nature, trying to put pressure on MPs and the government to keep biodiversity goals in place. So we are increasingly seeing the role of business as not only dealing with your own emissions, but enabling a policy landscape that would allow others to as well. So that's what we're following this year.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely fascinating, and I really like that idea, that the conveyor model that you describe. I think the piece that is emerging, which we've been discussing, is the construct of the infrastructure. I've got a tiny bit of echo coming from somebody. Who's that? Martin, we could ask you. Thank you. Just see if that helps. Yeah. Okay. The construct of the quality infrastructure, which is where standards and essentially don't necessarily become regulation, but the point is they start to work with regulation. So you're right to say standards bubble up and then they get generated, and then eventually the regulators and the industry community, indeed actually to be really properly inclusive, the whole stakeholder community, including those affected by climate change, they start to discuss how best these all work together to achieve the rapid outcome. What you don't want is standards say one thing and regulations say another thing, and then nobody knows what to do. So I think that this enhancement, I might say, to our friend Tom Hale about including in the model of the conveyor belt this concept of the quality infrastructure, which is where standards meet regulation and start to work together, whether they are from the industry practice side or through the formal structures, or indeed perhaps even from regulatory standards, which is another area altogether. But Martin, could I just turn to you about this issue of convergence? What do we need? I mean, you're always a professional association. Do we have the capacity? What do we do about supporting industry to get its head around all this?
Yeah, no, great point. And actually, it does flow from this issue around standards and regulations. So a really good example, practical example at the moment is the requirement now from the Environment Agency in the UK that permitted sites have got to do a climate risk assessment. Okay, really important. But the great thing is that they now point people to the ISO standards on climate adaptations. So say, okay, well, we expect you to do a climate risk assessment on the risks associated with extreme weather events and or changes in climate associated with your ability to meet your permit conditions and not cause pollution, etc. And we're recommending that you look at the ISO standard on climate adaptation as the basis for building this into your organization. We expect you to be looking at the ISO standard on risk and vulnerability assessment in climate change. So I think that's a good example. And the other one that I think is quite interesting is public procurement. So if you look at the Cabinet Office's they've said, right, okay, to back some of this up, we expect anybody who's bidding for a public contract over £5 million to have a net zero target and a plan to deliver on that. And then they point in the direction of standards that can help organisations to fulfil their obligations. Now, we spend billions of pounds through public contracts. Over 190 billion in the first 6 months. Contracts were written on the basis that a company had a net zero target and plan and was moving forward. So I think this is where standards, government policy and regulation come together in practical effect. And what's really important, and both Alexis and Ira have articulated, getting a common language for professionals to be able to work from this in their organisations is crucial. Because in practice, in a business, it requires the chief finance officer, the sustainability director, person who's leading on procurement, all to be understanding that common language, because all of these areas of professional activity in a firm require action, and it requires an integrated approach in a company to make the big transitions. And so I think, building up the capacity and capability, yes, there aren't enough people to do all the work that needs to be done with the skills to do it at the moment. So shortfall of electricians, so if we move, look to double the amount of electricity that we produce, make it all net zero, with changing automotive and mobility to be generated by, powered by electricity and battery technology, etc. So we need a lot of people to do that, but also just in mainstream firms, everybody needs to be able to get this, and they need to be aligned, and a common language and frameworks are really important. And I think that's where standards, really do help. And also, because we are talking here about passing through supply chains which can be longer and complex and into different countries, then again, having an international framework of standards that helps does provide that common language for people in different companies to speak to and understand what the expectations are. So I think there's a lot happening in this area, bringing things together.
Yeah, really interesting. Actually, we have been talking to the government commercial function, and actually opened the subject also in Wales and in Scotland about using public procurement to help accelerate a net zero transition by signposting standards that they would expect industry to be using should they be bidding for certain bits of work. And I think it's an incredibly powerful way to get culture change in industry in an entirely voluntary way, and we've seen that in other areas. So I hope that not just public procurement, but actually tier ones and major projects, private projects, would also go that route. We talked a little bit earlier, I hinted at that point about carbon neutrality and net zero, and I mentioned the voluntary carbon market era. Is that something that will surface in COP28? Is that a theme of, is the VCM, how does that fit in?
Yeah, sure, happy to comment on that one. So to be perfectly frank, the work of the TPT is is tangentially related to carbon markets. So it's not something that we focus on very strongly. What we have paid attention to is in the discussions that we've had with the various different organizations that have been involved within the TPT, as well as in the consultation, something that we've learned and that people have been saying again and again is that when it comes to the use of voluntary carbon credits, transparency really matters. At the moment, the lack of transparency behind how companies are using these carbon credits as part of their transition strategy and as part of their plans, and what use of carbon credits actually underlies some of the claims that they're making is a huge barrier when external groups such as investors are trying to understand the credibility of an entity's transition strategy. So very oftentimes you'll see company claims where it's not entirely clear to what extent does this rely on the mitigation actions that they're actually taking as opposed to purchase carbon credits. There's a nuance here that is maybe sometimes not as discussed or overlooked, is that carbon credits do have an important role to play in mobilizing capital. There's a role for them within the system, but there's a question of to what extent should they be used as part of a strategy to offset your own emissions. And I think something that we do in the TPT is within the framework, given we have a disclosure framework, we just ask for very clear transparency around what carbon credits are you using? How are these being, why are you using these as part of your strategy? What role do they play in your broader transition strategy? What benchmarks are you using to assess those carbon credits? And we do point people to some of the best practice guidance that is out there. Crucially, the VCMI, which has developed really useful guidance in terms of what are the claims that companies should be making on the back of carbon credits. And I think that's where we are currently in terms of the work that we've done in this particular space. But others might have points to add as well.
Yeah, and just before we leave you here, on the reporting side, how does it fit with the reporting? I mean, you kind of mentioned it there, I think, but when companies are trying to organize their reporting, you said it's about transparency and if they're using credits. Is that right?
Right.
How do the different structures see the use of credits, ISSB and TPT?
Absolutely. So I'll maybe start with the TPT, and then I can say a few words on ISSB as well. So in the TPT, what we've done is, we've created a disclosure framework that spells out all of the constituent pieces that we think need to be public about not only where you're planning to be tomorrow, but the steps that you take in order to get there. Now, in terms of that articulation of a company's target, a lot of them have focused quite narrowly on net zero and decarbonization targets. You could be setting other transition targets as well, particularly with regards to adaptation and resilience. But the challenge in a transition plan is then to detail out, first of all, what are the implementation steps that you're taking, who are you engaging with in your ecosystem to get there, but then also what are the metrics that you're using to track progress. So if you have a greenhouse gas emissions target as part of your transition plan, you then need to spell out how are you actually measuring progress. And what we've said in the TPT framework is that that should be measured separately from your use of carbon credits. So you need to make it very apparent as to what are the greenhouse gas emissions reductions that are actually arising from changes that you're making to the way that you operate. And then separately from that, are you purchasing any carbon credits and what role do they play in your overall achievement in the targets that you set? So just to allow external groups, including investors and other stakeholders, to just look at your transition plan and understand the nuance of what role carbon credits actually play in that strategy. And just to say a few words on ISSB, I think a lot of the ISSB doesn't go as much into detail on transition plans. It's a broader disclosure standard around how companies should be reporting on climate-related risks and opportunities. But that same principle also applies there. They've also looked at greenhouse gas emissions as part of that, and they've also looked at the use of carbon credits as part of that, and have separated those two out. So I think that's definitely a direction of travel that companies can start adjusting to now, that it's good practice to just be transparent about the distinction between the two.
It's absolutely fascinating, thank you. And before we leave this kind of general topic, and I'll come round, I'm going to invite Sarah to come and join us and help us with the questions in a few minutes. Martin, I didn't mean to cut you off earlier about resilience, but we were just in a finance kind of space, and I wanted to go over and so I'd love to come back to you, Martin, now and just ask you a bit more about resilience. And then Alexis, I'd love to lead on from resilience, because resilience is about people who are affected, and to talk about justice and what you think we should be looking for at COP28 in terms of justice. So Martin, perhaps let's just elaborate a tiny bit more on resilience and how you feel, what the role of standards are, or capacity and regulation. What's that? And then I'm going to come to you, Alexis, and ask you about justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been relatively well underplayed, I think, for many organisations in terms of resilience and climate adaptation, which is strange in some ways, because in terms of risk management, it's absolutely critical. And many organisations have seen direct impacts which have directly affected their ability to fulfil their objectives, have big financial impacts on them. So a really important issue. And I think where we're starting to see companies understand where climate resilience is really important in supply chains, and then the question is, what can they do to support enhancements of adaptive action? And we're starting to see this, I think, in food and agriculture, where an example would be Nestle. They committed £1 billion Swiss francs, about £1 billion, to supporting regenerative agriculture between now and 2030 for their coffee bean growers. Okay, so what they recognise is that Nescafe without coffee beans isn't much of a kind of brand or a company, and they have lots and lots of small farmers who are potentially kind of vulnerable to changing climate. So the question is, how can you, as part of corporate risk management in your supply chain, make a financial flow into some kind of form of enhancement that gives you a more secure supply. And I think, you know, these are happening now. We've seen them piloted in the UK. They're becoming bigger scale. And I think it's really interesting to see how companies are now starting to articulate climate risks through supply chains, and also being able to price that and then say, okay, well, how can we get financial flows? I think there's a real opportunity then for companies to start to use standards to formalize some of this type of action, and also and explore where they have those vulnerabilities, but also then to give organizations in their supply chain actually kind of help and support through the use of standards and kind of explaining what's going to be expected. So that's where we're starting to see. It was, you know, interesting discussions last year in Sharm el Sheikh at COP. I expect to see more of this coming through as companies really understand where kind of risks and vulnerabilities lie, and then starting to think about what mechanisms might be needed to address them.
Brilliant, and thank you. And so companies and what they do affect people, Alexis. So it's justice and equity. These are big themes that we read about in the press and the media. What does that mean for us here?
Yeah, I mean, it's big terms and should be basically threaded into every single one of the themes that we've talked about today. We've done some academic work on this within Oxford Net Zero on how, you know, how the framing of net zero has somewhat been misaligned or decoupled from the goals of the climate justice movement, and having a net zero pledge that focuses more on the net than the zero inherently has profound justice implications. I think one thing that we are thinking a lot about in terms of justice and equity is, as I mentioned, the accountability landscape and making sure that pledges are actually followed through on. But another piece that we kind of are interested in is just this discussion and contention around fossil fuel phase out. And so there will be a big debate this year over if fossil fuels is discussed, fossil fuel phase out is discussed, big narrative fight over the words unabated or abated fossil fuels. So we're kind of expecting to see language in the text that is something along the lines of phase down of unabated fossil fuels, rather than a phase out of fossil fuels. For context, the first time that fossil fuels were ever mentioned in the text was last year, so it's fairly new and sorry, in COP26 rather, but the first time that it had ever been mentioned in a cover text. And yeah, the language there was very weak. It was kind of accelerating efforts towards a phase down of unabated coal power, and phasing out of quote unquote inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, and then that changed to rationalizing inefficient fossil fuel subsidies later. So there is a big discussion there in terms of justice on, yes, we could phase down unabated fossil fuels, and that will be essential to
just explain the difference between abated and unabated, just so we're all on the same page here.
Yeah, sorry. Abated basically means capturing the carbon, the greenhouse gas emissions, and unabated means not. But there is contention because there is not full kind of agreement or understanding of what abatement means and on what time horizons. That is largely understood to be geological sequestration, so carbon capture and storage, or other. But there's kind of a conflation of greenhouse gas removal with just carbon capture and storage. There are other forms of carbon capture of greenhouse gas removal. But I think for us, something I'm personally very invested in is abated fossil fuels don't handle or don't undo the harms of fossil fuels that have nothing to do with too much carbon in the atmosphere. So obviously, yes, burning fossil fuels causes carbon in the atmosphere, releases carbon into the atmosphere, and that causes climate change, which is inherently unjust. But the extraction of fossil fuels also brings a huge amount of justice implications, including land rights violations, human health impacts at source, biodiversity losses. These are all huge implications of fossil fuels that are not captured by simply abating the emissions of fossil fuels. And while, something that we discuss a lot within our research group is you cannot fully abate fossil fuels and continue to use them at the level you are now. So inherently, phasing out unabated fossil fuels is reducing drastically our use of fossil fuels, because if a company were fully abating the emissions from their product, they would not be able to make it as much, especially with the competitiveness of renewables. But it is yeah.
But I mean, that also affects other primary industries and extractive industries as well, doesn't it, at that point?
Yeah, no, completely. And yeah, there's been a big discussion over whether or not fossil fuel interests should have a seat at the table at COP. There has been a big lobbying, especially from the UK Youth Climate Coalition, about having people declare their interests or their affiliations with fossil fuel companies when they arrive to COP. That has not really taken off because there's so many vested interests in COP. But knowing what we know and knowing the disruptive impacts that the fossil fuel industry has had on climate action since the 70s, is it ethical to have them there? That's a big kind of point of discussion, and especially when fossil fuel lobbyists are given more passes than some of the most climate vulnerable nations in the world. So that is a profound discussion about climate justice. Another piece that people don't really think about in COP, but I always like to mention when I get to talk about COP, is just the profound inequities that are baked into the UNFCCC. For example, when we think about badge allocation and who gets a badge and who gets to go to COP and who gets to be there as a negotiator, just at COP27 last year, the United States, the largest historical polluter in the world, brought about 300 delegates in their negotiating teams, which meant they were across every single room. They were briefed, they were ready to go, they were well slept. Well, maybe that's a bit of an overstatement, but they were there and able to kind of participate in the negotiations and therefore get the outcomes that they wanted. If you compare that with some of the most climate vulnerable nations in the world, who are bringing a delegation of maybe a few dozen people or maybe even a dozen people to the same negotiations to have the same, vote, who are meant to be across so many different negotiation items, while looking after their Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Trade or whatever at home, it's profoundly unjust. And also when we think about just the kind of practical bits of COP, of who books out the hotels closest to the venue, it is always the richest countries who can book it early, who can have that kind of ability to do that. So the United States delegates bringing 300 people and staying at a hotel right next to the expo center means that they have an hour or more of sleep every day. We saw, last year and at COP26 too, delegates taking a bus for an hour to get back to their accommodations, falling asleep on the bus and having to.
I remember that. I fell asleep on the bus too, actually.
Yeah. But I think it's just one of those pieces that is so hidden and under discussed. And for me, I also have worked in the UN negotiation space before in my last job, and this kind of I think it's profoundly unjust, and it makes me really upset.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, thank you for sharing, because it's great to hear it. It is profoundly difficult, and actually, even in the simple old, what we think of the simple world of the international standards community, we have almost exactly the same conversations about how to engage countries, emerging economies, developing countries, small island nations in the international standards system in a fair and equitable way, and it's really difficult. And saying things like, oh well, we can do things online. Actually, you can't. You do have to meet. But how do people afford to travel, and how do their carbon footprint deal with that? It's a conundrum, actually. I suppose in terms of all of that, we work very hard in the standard system to make sure that we have trained representatives, and then you have proper governance processes. That means that you can't just be shouted down by the richest people in the room, and that's a long-standing problem, Alexis. So thank you for flagging it up for us. Could I just do one more? Sorry.
If I could just make a quick plug for something, which is that one thing that we heard a lot as well from youth activists last year was that youth are being invited to the table, but not given the capacity building tools to be able to put their advocacy asks in the language of the UNFCCC. So just to give a quick kind of overview, the last year we've been working with Oxford Net Zero. We've delivered this global youth climate training program, which is a 13-week program for young climate activists. We had 4,500 activists on our program that just ended a few months ago, and basically that was trying to answer that need of capacity building and making sure that they understand how to frame their asks in the language of the UNFCCC. And we delivered that course for free in 4 different languages, and that's kind of our effort to do capacity building. But there's so much more, and so many other institutions, including the standards community, who really should be doing that active capacity building effort, because that gap between climate vulnerable nations and rich nations will not close if we don't have that capacity building.
Well, I saw here's a hot tip for you. I saw a fantastic platform the other day, which was an AI enabled platform that allowed training to be provided, obviously through avatars in any language you want, and it was so that's just what you need, isn't it, for that community. Could I do one more whip round the table, if you don't mind? Just what for you? We're coming to the audience now, so coming to our community of businesses, and what is it that what's going to impact them most? What's the impact on UK businesses from all of this thing that we've talked about? What's your sort of number 1, 2, 3 that they need to watch out for? Ira, can I come to you first, and then Martin, and then back to Alexis?
Yeah, of course.
What's the impact on the businesses listening to this call?
So I think the number one takeaway is that the international momentum on understanding the credibility behind any climate pledges and understanding the actions that companies are actually taking that's really taking off across all different forums. Not only in the UK, where we have the TPT and all of the kind of momentum behind that building, but you have similar movements happening in Europe. There's discussions across the ASEAN forums around similar concepts around how do you create credibility into transition finance, and this conversation it's huge. Is I think the one big thing, and what this means for UK companies is, I think going forward we can really start to come to a place where you can expect that those companies that are now taking early steps to try and figure out, okay, what does this transition actually mean? What does it mean for me to credibly reach net zero? What levers do I have available to help the people around me reach net zero? Because you're operating within interdependent systems, which means you will depend on others. Sometimes there's collective actions that you can take to help unlock those barriers, but you need to be thinking quite systemically and quite strategically about those. But those companies that are taking those steps now and trying to unpack some of these challenges will be much better placed to really have a place in tomorrow's economy. And I think that's the number one message is early action will pay off, and it's part of the robust future planning that everyone should be doing now.
Yeah, and we feel that in BSI too, actually, as part of our plan. So that's thank you for reminding us. Critical. Martin, what do you think of the themes we kind of discussed? What's the impact you'd flag for UK business?
Well, I would just build on what Ira has said. And it's one we haven't really addressed in the conversation yet, but actually flowing from the disclosure standards is going to be requirements for companies to be reporting on product and service intensity of greenhouse gases. Because if you are having to account for scope 3 emissions in your supply chain, it's not like, we use some Microsoft products. We're not going to account for 100% of Microsoft's kind of global emissions. We actually want the emissions associated with them delivering cloud-based services to us and the services that we provide. So I think as we start to unpack the implications of ISSB and all of the disclosure requirements that are pushing them to disclose on scope 3, then companies are going to have to be able to provide that information in a way in which can be managed by a reporting entity, but also the way in which you do that means that you've got to have a really good understanding of not just your overall footprint, but also how that footprint aligns into the products and services that you're providing. And that's kind of an evolving area. I've seen it in contractual requirements now. I've seen it, move towards this. It's starting to happen. And again, I don't think there's kind of very much been done about that, but I think that's the implications of where we're heading, is that people on this call, if you're in business, you need to think about not just reporting entity emissions, but also how you kind of that flows into your products and services as well.
Brilliant, thank you, Martin. And Alexis, the last comment, how is this going to impact UK business? And then Sarah, I'm coming.
Yeah, so many pieces that have already been touched on by Ira and Martin, which are excellent. I think that a growing accountability landscape and a tighter, stricter definition of what a credible net zero target looks like will be key. And just some work that I'm involved in is on the professional services side, so trying to have a better, firmer understanding of what we're calling serviced emissions, so the emissions that are enabled or facilitated by professional services firms like law firms or consulting firms. These are also have always kind of sat, to Martin's point about kind of understanding the impact of your supply chain, these have always sat in a bit of a gray area because you're a consultative service and the influence of your advice has never really fully been captured, but that is sort of a loophole that's starting to be tightened much more. So I think if there are any businesses who are professional services firms, that guidance is sort of coming down the pipeline It will be launched on the 4th of December, and then we have a consultation period for 3 months, so you have your opportunity to give your input, and that's through the Race to Zero campaign.
Alexis, thank you. Thank you, all three of you. What a fantastically rich discussion that was. My head is bursting with ideas and themes and impacts. It's just brilliant. Thank you so much. Now, we do have some questions. We have questions from our audience. And Sarah, would you be willing to rejoin us and perhaps to ask some of these questions? Help us through.
Yes, of course. Yes, we've had a lot of questions. We had quite a few before the webinar, and they've been coming in thick and fast as well. So the discussion has definitely prompted a lot of thought in our audience here. So we had a question before actually about the targets that countries have signed to achieve and what they're currently doing, and what your knowledge of what that is, and also if you have some sense of what data there might be on how industry sectors are currently performing against the things that they have signed to, the objectives that have been signed to. Do you have any thoughts on that? Do you have any information to share about it?
Sharing targets and sharing performance, is that the question?
Yeah.
Has anybody published actual evidence?
Actual evidence, yeah.
Yeah, I'll drop in there. So if you go to climatetracker.org, it's a fantastic website because it has a real understanding of what are the ambitions that countries have said, what are their actions, and how well aligned are their targets to a net zero future. So they got them for many, many countries. You can see there, you can go on, you can find out about the UK, so our actions are not in line with our ambition at the moment, so we're falling behind. It talks about finance. So that's a really good website. And it also has some kind of sector lenses as well, so you can look through there. So that's a website that I use to kind of, really good source of information.
Climatetracker.org. That sounds great.
Okay. Any specific companies that you think you would rate as having published good information? Or are we still waiting for organizations to produce reliable data? Alexis, Ira?
So I think as the TPT is quite careful to not publicly endorse certain companies' transition plans. So that's something. So I'm not going to be naming individual companies, but I think there is in terms of
sectors. Are there sectors you can point out? Are there sectors that are out in front of other sectors? I mean, don't comment if you don't feel you can, but.
I mean, in the UK context, I'd say it's very, very worthwhile looking at the analysis of the Climate Change Committee and that they put out every single year. And they have, I think, very good, very granular analysis around which are the sectors that we can now see that are on track and the ones that are really behind, and what steps would be needed in order to unlock some of those barriers. Very, very useful piece of analysis that we are also starting to see this private sector rely on in very interesting ways.
Okay, super.
Could I chip in on that, Scott? Because I think what's interesting in the UK is some of the work that Broadway Initiative has been doing with and linking into the government's Net Zero Business Council is that whole sector alignment, and actually sectors working together to say, okay, well, here are our roadmaps, and if it's the hospitality sector or the retail sector or the food and drink sector or the manufacturing sector, but also then starting to look at where the interdependencies are and where the gaps might be. So I think there's some kind of interesting work that's happening there to start to take national targets into sector approaches, but also then looking at where do sectors need to be at a particular point in time, and what are the technologies that they might be using, and how dependent are they on other sectors being able to deliver those, and therefore where are the gaps. So it's kind of some pretty good insights now coming on that, which people might be interested in.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. And Ira talked earlier to all of us. She talked about the advantage that businesses would have if they think about their plans really properly now. This point about if I'm just a small business I mean, do I just let this all happen? It's all for the big people and the countries or the sectors. What about me? You know, what steps do I take as a small business? What's the best thing to do? Is it about getting my transition plan organized? Is it about working in supply chains where I'll be part of a sort of community of people? Or what's the best thing to do? Maybe Alexis, maybe this is for you. What steps, what would you say to an SME audience?
Yeah, I think SMEs are such important players and make up such a massive amount. I mean, there's some great statistic about how many businesses in the world are SMEs. I would say that the SME Climate Hub has a great kind of place for information about how SMEs can participate in climate action. I do think that is the main kind of drawback of a lot of this net zero credibility landscape, is that they do not apply very well to SMEs. For example, and a lot of them just put the caveat in that this might look different for SMEs, and that's sort of the extent of it. So there is a big gap in the landscape in making sure that that can apply to SMEs, which is difficult because an SME could be one person and an SME could be 100 people. So it's hard to get advice that really crosses the breadth of that. But I would say the SME Climate Hub is sort of the space that we go to for best practice information for SMEs. And I just wanted to add to something that was said earlier, just on different industries and sectors. And again, we also don't call out specific companies, but the Net Zero Tracker, which is an initiative of the University of Oxford, as well as 3 other partners at the University of North Carolina and New Climate Institute and the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, that is a collaboration to track the net zero targets of the Forbes 2000 list. So the largest publicly listed companies, 2000 largest publicly listed companies in the world, every country in the world, and every city above 100,000 in population. This is an open data set, and we do a stock take report every year where we kind of give an analysis of the data. And it's a good read. So it's at zerotracker.net, and the report is the Net Zero Stock Take report. And so we've done 2 so far, but the one in the summer, so my team and I wrote chapter 4 of that, which was basically about the landscape for net zero accountability and credibility, the different standards and kind of what's missing. So if people are interested in that kind of analysis there, but the Net Zero Tracker is incredible and does a really good job of getting understanding across the landscape. So they would have more data because they aggregate it by sector as well.
So that's fantastic. And Alexis, you had a great plug earlier. Martin, can I come to you? Do you want to plug for AIMA? How, I mean, taking this point about getting information to the SME community, does AIMA have a program or?
Yeah, so we've been collaborating with, well, the government, but also a range of, Federation of Small Business, British Chambers of Commerce, some of the banks actually, because they've got kind of big customer bases. And everything's been pulled into what's called the Business Climate Hub.uk.
Right.
There's free advice there. So one of the things that you can do there is you can say, I want to address this. I can put in my sector, I can put in my location, and it will give you a generic plan. So for you to start to take climate action, it will hook you into some support that might be available locally, because there are different kind of support mechanisms for SMEs which are out there. There's also lots of practical advice that if you are interested in electric vehicles, it will tell you everything that you need to know in one place around how you can make a decision whether this is right for your small business. And the same with heat pumps, the same with energy efficiency. So, and it's linked into the SME Climate Hub, but this is kind of the UK lens with lots of free, but it's all completely free. So I would start there. And that's what, we've put a lot of time and effort into helping to get that site moving. So
great,
yeah.
Martin, just say it again, because that sounded really great. Say it again.
Businessclimatehub.uk.
Businessclimatehub.uk. Thank you. That was really brilliant. Sarah,
yeah,
great little. Where do you want to go next? What else is on your list?
Well, the other things that have been asked, somebody has asked if the panel has a view about the Energy Charter Treaty and reform of that, and whether COP is the appropriate forum to progress change on that.
The Energy Charter Treaty. Okay, right. Let's Energy Charter. Who can pick this up? Anyone?
Anyone have a thought on that? If you don't, you don't have to.
Martin.
Just
Yeah.
it came in.
So this just very kind of top line. So the Energy Charter effectively was a legal basis on which countries would encourage investment in energy infrastructure, and you would have a pretty kind of firm guarantee that that would be kind of, you would have that stand by. So if you got private sector financing investment into a country's energy infrastructure, that you would be able to get a return on your investment. And one of the big challenges now is that we are locked in with, you know, fossil fuel based energy sources, and the question is, should companies who've made those investments be compensated if governments of today say, actually, we don't want to kind of continue with this, and suddenly you end up with potentially a loss of return that you might have expected. So it's kind of very litigious. The litigation is behind closed doors, so this interstate kind of dispute mechanisms which nobody can kind of get behind. And the question then is, should the countries, and this is a Europe kind of thing, so it's not really a basis for COP, although it kind of is joined at COP in the context of, we need to hit our climate ambitions, and if we continue with this, then it's kind of, how do we get the funds if we're going to be paying off fossil fuel companies with compensation for us not kind of using fossil fuels anymore. That's kind of that's the big thing, but it's a big European question as to whether countries should come out of the Energy Charter or not.
And Martin, I mean, and Alexis, it goes to the sort of individual level as well, doesn't it? I mean, if policy in your country or regulations change and you can no longer use this technology, whether it's, I don't know, gas boilers or diesel cars or the rest of it, and you just bought one, people get a bit aggrieved, don't they? And they say, well, listen, I can't use an electric vehicle. I live in the country and there's no charging points. It's a bit unfair. I mean, how do we make sure we get public acceptability for the changes that have to happen? We have to do this. And what's your advice for policymakers to try and bring the public with them on this journey? Because if the public are demanding it, then companies surely will address it. But if they're not, if they're resistant, they won't.
Yeah, and I think that really speaks to that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to climate action. I think one framing that has been really helpful, so Chris Skidmore, who's a Tory MP, was charged with doing the sort of review of net zero within the government and published his Mission Zero report.
Skidmore, that's right, yes, the Skidmore, yeah.
Skidmore review. I think what was interesting about that politically was that he did a very was very intentional about making the net zero transition about opportunity rather than the sort of risks and costs and others. And I was actually in a conversation with all UK universities who do in doing climate research are part of something called the UK Universities Climate Network. And we had a discussion on the network call the other day about how the messaging on the kind of climate chaos and the harmful impacts of breaching limits is not really landing with the public, either because they've been oversaturated or maybe it feels really disempowering among many other horrible things that are happening in the world. But that opportunity messaging really does land with people. And I think what I've been trying to do personally when I speak to people about climate change is really highlight, like, yes, we're not where we need to be, but we are in such a different place than we would have been if we had just ignored this issue and if we had let kind of the people with the power to make the decisions for us. You know, when we look at the projections of emissions before the Paris Agreement versus where they are now, it's actually tremendous what the Paris Agreement has done in getting us all on the same page. People knock COPs and Paris agreements all the time, and I'm the first one to do that, but because I don't think it's going fast enough. But I do think that we need to acknowledge that there is international collaboration to some extent on this issue, and that's important. And I think what we should in the language that we use a lot in our research group is about sensitive intervention points, and that we have so many areas where a small change could kind of take off. And we've seen that with like renewables, we've seen that with EVs, we've seen that with some technological pieces. But I think the main thing that is holding us back now is not the economic feasibility, it's not the technological feasibility, it's really the political feasibility. And it's important to not leave people behind. And just as an example, in Oxfordshire where I live, there was a big consultation about low traffic neighborhoods and having areas that were blocked off, certain roads that were blocked off, and it's really, really politically contentious. There was like a huge demonstration and all these things. And one thing that we tried to do was there was a citizens assembly about it, and we were trying to frame language about climate change and why emissions, dealing with emissions from transport was really important. But I also made it a point to acknowledge that it is difficult for people to move around the city without access to cars because of the way that the city is laid out, because of poor public transport networks. If you're not, if you're disabled, or if you're moving with several children, it's a difficult city to move around. And so instead of saying we're going to cut off these roads, and if you're not a pedestrian or a cyclist, then so be it, we should really be thinking about inclusive transport systems. And that's just a microcosm of an issue, right? But I think that if you're making climate policy that still excludes people and furthers the rift between wealthy and not wealthy people, it's not good climate policy, and it's not good policy. So thinking about it as an opportunity to create more, for example, just as like if we think about Oxfordshire transport, if we think about it as an opportunity to create a city that is more inclusive and more considerate of different needs of people moving around, and use climate as a way into that discussion, then that for me is a huge win. Because yeah, there are many other reasons why transport is bad, and so just trying to think about the vision, and including, we're trying to create a UK that is accepting of people, innovative, trying to kind of think about the values that we're trying to embody, and using climate policy as a way to open that, rather than as a kind of punishing way. I think people think of the energy transition as sitting in the cold, sitting in the cold and not having access to energy and having to give up a lot of things. But I think what we should reframe it as is having stable energy that is being generated close to your home through renewable circuit, and having the opportunity to live and work in areas where your chest isn't being compressed by toxic fumes from cars and things like that. And doing the flip side of it, basically, of what our reality could look like.
And we have come quite a long way, actually. I mean, you're quite right to point that out. I do think that it's amazing, actually, what we can do. So whether it's going to be autonomous vehicles or other technologies that will help people in the future, I think it's going to be great. Okay, Sarah, we're going to close in a couple of minutes. Anything else you want to flag?
Well, there was a question about the role of standardization supporting public policy to tackle climate change. Does anybody want to say something about that?
Well,
how would it? What is the role of standardization supporting public policy?
I think can I answer that then? I think it has a huge role, but when we talk about standardization, it's a very difficult word, and I don't think that we mean standardization in the sense of making everything the same. I don't think that's very helpful. I think I'd like to use the word in the sense of consensus, perhaps in Alexis's language, of making sure that the voices are heard and that we have appropriate agreement and therefore buy-in and ownership of the solutions that we're bringing forward. And the role of the standards community is to provide those platforms for people to agree what good looks like, and to do it at global level and at regional level and at national level, and indeed even at local level, Alexis. I think there's an underused capability here, maybe for the communities in Oxfordshire, to say what does good practice look like in terms of sustainable transport and accessibility in our community, and actually getting right down to what is a local kind of standard, exploiting some of the work that's done. So for me, the role of standards is about the role of communities, whether they're global communities, industry communities, sectors, indigenous peoples. It's the whole thing, and bringing that knowledge to the world of the regulator and the government, where they have other obligations on them: security, resilience, protection, and health and safety, food, and that sort of thing, all the challenges that we see in the world today. So it's then our responsibility, coming from that world, to funnel, to channel, not to tell people what to do at all, but actually to carry their opinions to work with on the conveyor model, to work with the regulatory bodies to say, this is how this could really work. And there are so many nuances to that, and it depends on your culture, it depends on your regulatory background, your history, the way you do things in your country, whether you're prescriptive or performance, so many nuances. I think we have to accept that regulation legislation, of course, is never going to be harmonized. I mean, it's absolutely no chance ever of imagining that. And people have argued that you see within the European Union perhaps a sort of high point of that. But after that, you look at what happens now, fragmentation around the world and people using regulation. So let's imagine that all of these jurisdictions will do it their own way, and they need to. But what they can use is common understanding of standards created by human beings that say this is what the planet needs, and we agree to do this. And at that point, you may get the sort of pull through that we're all looking for, and that we have seen in certain areas where if you just get it right, the whole thing can flip very rapidly. So I think that the role of standardization and part of that quality infrastructure that is so invisible, certainly in the UK, measurement, intellectual property, standards, market surveillance, elevating that to become part of the conversation and part of the critical toolkit for government is a high priority for us. And no longer in the shadows, we need to be out there representing the people, representing the SMEs, representing industry, and making sure that the international community are all on the same page. It's the one common currency, standardization, that the world has to agree on ways of doing things that are good and that can work with regulation on that conveyor model in the most effective way. There you are. There's an answer. Speaking from the chair.
Does anybody else want to say something on that, or there is a question on the challenges that you see coming in 2024 and what you might hope the legacy of COP28
That's a brilliant. Let's use that question let's circle around our fabulous panelists and ask them that question. What challenges do you see after COP? What's it going to leave behind, and what do you think is it's a challenge for next year? And then we're going to close. Ira, you'll go first.
I'm gonna be cheeky and twist the question a tiny little bit, and I'm gonna focus on what challenges do I see for the private sector community, particularly the one here in the UK.
Okay.
Right, I said earlier that there is a huge amount of momentum and pressure building to start to develop credible transition plans, and I think that is something that more and more companies will be faced with. There's science towards regulatory implementation. There's also, independent of that, a huge amount of pressure coming from the financial community that companies need to be doing this. And what I think any company that is going to be starting on that journey will face quite quickly is that developing those strategies isn't easy because there's a whole lot of uncertainties and assumptions that you're making in that planning process. You don't always have reliable forecasts around what technology costs are going to look like over the future that you rely on in order to actually reach your targets. You might not know whether the policies are going to be in place in 5 years that you think you need in order to actually be able to reach the target that you've set yourself. And you'll be making assumptions about all sorts of things, including some, like things that you could measure, but that is possible to measure, but is currently due to technical challenges not possible. So, for example, around scope 3, that might improve going forward, and other things are just an inherent plan, like part of making a forward-looking plan. And companies are going to face the challenge of having to put out transition plans while grappling with those uncertainties and needing to become comfortable with that. Now, the difficulty here is that we don't really have time to wait for companies to develop a perfect plan and then come out with that in 10 years. And also, it's ultimately not necessarily the purpose of the transition planning process. What you need is transparency around what you don't know and what you do know, and what you know that you depend on others doing, and getting that out in the open. So I think one of the challenges in the business community will be having that conversation internally to be comfortable with the gaps and being transparent about the gaps, and then building and learning on that over time. And I think that's a difficult, I think, space to inhabit for a lot of company leadership teams, and particularly boards that like to have a lot of certainty around any public statements that they make. And that's a learning process that the private sector is going to move through over the next coming years that I think will change a lot and will be difficult to grapple with.
Fantastic, that's really clear. Thank you, Ira, brilliant. Alexis, what's your challenge for 24, and what's the legacy of 28 going to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think picking up on what Ira just said about whether or not the sort of policy will be in place, I think that's a huge one, is understanding the consistency of the landscape. And we've seen that, especially in the UK, a lot of back and forth on policy, which makes it a really unstable environment to make climate commitments in the long term. So I think that will be kind of a key challenge. I think for the state community, it will be about keeping the momentum of COP28 going throughout the year and using that as a way to advocate for stronger domestic policy on climate. And then, of course, all the kind of challenges of implementing any regional or political commitments that come out of COP28. Because sometimes COP28 is a bit of a moment where leaders get a bit, they run away with the excitement and make a sort of sometimes a big pledge that then people have to scramble to figure out how to do. So it can be a moment of positively inciting some change that needs to be then delivered. But I think, yeah, as Ira said, as the credibility landscape becomes much more clear, it will be harder to have poor net zero pledges, and I think that will be a key challenge for the business.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for that. Poor challenge. Yeah, exactly. Martin, your challenge. What do you think?
Yeah, so I think two things. So I think the reality will probably be that 2024 we'll see more extreme weather events and we'll see more temperature records being broken, and that will put the level of ambition on translating that into action from COP28 into perspective, and unfortunately. So I think that kind of the imperative becomes clearer with every moment that passes. I think the other one, though, is coming back into the UK. It's just going to be the extent to which political going into a general election.
Sorry, is that you? Oh, thank you. Thanks, Martin.
So I think the issue is also going to be, how does climate change play out in the election?
Yeah. Okay.
What's the division, and also are the commitments that political parties put into their manifestos credible, and can they be delivered? So that's, I think, there are big questions about whether that's actually going to be. So I think climate change will be a political football in the UK next year, and we'll have to see where that lands.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you for reminding us of the ongoing travelator of the political climate. Thank you, Martin. Thank you very much indeed. Panelists, wonderful. Ira, Alexis, Martin, thank you so much for all of your help today. I mean, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I have hugely enjoyed moderating it, and I've learned a great deal, and I'm sure that all our listeners will have learned a great deal too. And Sarah, thank you to you for opening and helping us through with those questions. We're going to wrap up now. I'm going to say we're going to circulate all of you with a little bit more information about the program in COP, and if you want to meet Ira Putzkin, Alexis McGibbon, or Martin Baxter, or myself, I think we'll all be there, and we look forward to meeting you. Do get in touch. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today, and thank you to the team for this webinar. And that's it. Let's say goodbye and good luck, and let's help the world change for the better. Thank you very much, all of you.
Yes, thank you. And just to say that people have been very pleased to have the resources that you've all mentioned. So we'll try to gather those and send that out as well with the timetable. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, and let's close. Thanks very much. Goodbye.